Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm really excited to be doing this, and I'll explain why in a minute, but I will say that I have not practiced this, so hopefully I don't go over time, because I really do want to provide you with as much information as possible and still leave time for questions if there are questions. So we'll see how this goes. And I guess one of the reasons I'm excited to do this is because I, as an archivist and an oral historian, I had the pleasure of processing and making more accessible 3 manuscript collections at the Montana Historical Society this summer, and they were all 3 of those collections were papers from women Constitutional Convention delegates, so Louise Cross, Dorothy Eck, and Arlene Reichert. And I also had the opportunity to do an oral history interview with Arlene Reichert, which will be available at the Historical Society in a month or 2 once I get it transcribed and she's had a chance to review it. So I've known about the Con for a while, ever since I moved to Montana, basically, and I never realized how unique the convention was. And for those of you who aren't familiar, in 1972, Montana decided to revise its constitution. And so, but I'll get into that with my presentation. Is there any way to share my screen?
No, I think we would have to share our screen. Do you have a PowerPoint?
Yes, I do.
Is there any way you can email it to me or share with me via Google Doc?
Yes, I can do that. Sorry, I did not realize.
Oh, actually, I'll just make you a co-host and you can share your
screen.
That was silly of me. There you go.
Oh, that's okay. Okay. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay, wave or something if you can't see it, and I'll. Okay, so one of the things that I found interesting while I was processing these collections is how much back and forth there was between the delegates, and I was focusing specifically on women delegates, but there was a lot of back and forth between. It didn't, regardless of gender. But so here's a little background about the convention. So they 100 delegates were elected to oversee the process of revising the state constitution. And out of those 100 delegates, 19 of them were women, and that's almost 20%, which was unprecedented representation at that time. There were just, of the states that were revising their constitutions around the same time, and there were actually quite a few, they didn't have nearly the female representation that Montana did. And at the request of the delegates, they were seated alphabetically by last name rather than political party, because they really wanted this process not to be about partisanship and to be about trying to create the best working constitution for Montana and for the people of Montana. And one delegate, Maynann Ellingson, who I'll talk about in a little bit, said that she noticed there were more differences between people who lived in the rural areas of Montana and the urban areas rather than based on Republican or Democrat. And the great thing about the Con is that all of the transcripts, they did verbatim transcripts of all of the proceedings, and they are available online through the Internet Archive. And if you haven't checked out the Internet Archive, you should, because it's got all kinds of amazing digitized materials that are available, from old video games that you can play to scanned documents and manuscripts. And then the Historical Society holds the Constitutional Convention records. So if you're interested and you want to head to Helena, you can look at those paper copies. So here's a picture of the delegates. It's a pretty great picture. And there were 19 of them. And unfortunately, not all of them were interviewed. No oral history interview exists that we know of, or their papers aren't at an archival institution. But there are actually quite a few women whose papers in some form or another are at an archives here in Montana. More women delegates have their papers archived in Montana or anywhere than the men delegates, which is pretty amazing because there were 81 men delegates, and you would think that a lot of them would have saved their papers or donated them, but that's not the case, at least not right now. So a lot of the women delegates saved letters from their constituents, from people back home who wrote to them about the Constitutional Convention and about the process. And they responded. And that was one of the things I noticed when it came to civil discourse. There were letters from women who disagreed with their delegate on a lot of political issues, but they said, I am so thrilled that you're there because you're a woman. I wouldn't necessarily vote to elect you as like a state representative, but I'm thrilled that there are women on the con. And this woman writes from Glendive. She's writing to Delegate Louise Cross. As a Montana woman, I take pride in your election to the Constitutional Convention. We are about 50% of the human race. Government affects each of us every bit as much as it does our men. And then she goes on to ask Louise if she has any thoughts about why there's 19% female representation on the convention. So she even right at the very beginning, women in Montana were noticing that this was unprecedented and this was something new. So civil discourse and primary sources, I've been thinking a lot about civil discourse because of the current political climate we're living in. It does seem to be something new and different, at least from what I can tell. And part of the reason I make that claim is because when you have access to archival records, and you can kind of look back at the way things were happening in the moment that they were happening, it does seem like this particular time period has become more acrimonious. And I'm not working in government, so I can't say that for a fact, but there just seems to be something really respectful in the communication between these women and between other delegates and also with their constituents. And you can, the great thing is, if you live in Montana and you're a citizen of Montana, of the state of Montana, these materials in the archives and public archives are your materials. We hold them in trust for the people of the state of Montana, which means that unless they're restricted for some reason, you can come in and you can request to look at them. So definitely take advantage of that. There's an archives at the University of Montana. I work there, and we work really, really hard to let students know what we have that might be pertinent to anything they're interested in or studying. And primary sources are different from secondary sources because they are created in the moment. They are not a reflection on something later on, like a book that pulls from various documents. So newspaper articles, someone's handwritten notes, their correspondence, anything they've collected, that would be considered a primary source. Oral history interviews, those verbatim transcripts I was talking about. And part of the reason I think that doing primary source research is so important is because history shouldn't be told from one perspective, and for such a long time it has been told from one perspective. And the beauty of archives is that we can find those multiple perspectives, we can find all kinds of different voices, we can start to challenge the notion of, well, what is history and what actually happened at a historical moment. And so the primary sources I've been working with demonstrate how the women delegates and all of the delegates, but again, focusing specifically on the women, they really work to gain consensus for the Constitution among the people of Montana, which sometimes meant compromising and giving up on some things that they thought were really important. And one of those people was Arlene Reichert. I got to interview Arlene. She's amazing. She's almost 95, but she is still advocating for preservation of historic landmarks in Great Falls. And she is the most wonderful person to talk to. She kept apologizing for talking, and I kept telling her how honored I was that she was doing an interview with me. She was from Great Falls. She still lives there. She was an advocate of the unicameral legislature, so where there's only one body. Instead of a House and a Senate, there's just one governing body. She served on the legislative committee, and then she also served as a Montana State House representative for 2 years. And she said that after working as a delegate at the con and it being a single body, she said her experience in the legislature later on was really disappointing because she felt like there wasn't the camaraderie, the ability to really debate and get to know the issues. You had to rely on lobbyists. And she said that was so different from her experience at the convention that she just decided that it wasn't for her. And as I said, she's still a historic preservation advocate. So Arlene is a great example of the power of compromise. And if you go to Helena and look at her papers, there are letters from her to other delegates and back and forth. And they are talking about the unicameral, which was well accepted within the convention among the delegates, but they were worried that their constituents were not going to go for it. And so when I was talking to Arlene about this, I said, you know, how disappointed were you when it was decided that it wouldn't be included in the body of the Constitution? And she said, I was the one who suggested it. She said, I knew that it would basically tank the Constitution if we included it in the body of it and then we put it to the Montana people for a vote. So she said, I suggested it become a sub option that people could vote on separately from the rest of the Constitution. And it failed. The Constitution itself passed, but the unicameral sub-option failed. And she said, I really believe that if it had been included in the body, that the entire Constitution would fail. And that wasn't right because it still was a good document. And we wanted it for the people of Montana. And so here's an example of someone really setting aside her own strong feelings about something and saying, okay, you know what, for the benefit of what we're trying to do here, this is one thing that I think we can let go. And then here's just a fun little note from Louise Cross to Arlene Reichert, and she just is expressing how much she's enjoyed working with Reichert. And there were lots, I mean, I could have scanned hundreds of pages of these kinds of communication between the women delegates where they are just providing each other with support and kindness and thoughtfulness, even if they don't agree on things, still being willing to try to see it from someone else's perspective or think about the larger picture and then provide them feedback based on what they have seen or heard from their constituents or from other delegates. And then Lucille Spear, who worked at the University of Montana Library, she was the government documents librarian for many years. She did an entire series of oral history interviews, and they're just chock full of all kinds of great anecdotes and tidbits about the different delegates. And she said that Arlene Reichert was the best delegate. She was not as persuasive a debater as Maynan, but so far as her knowledge was concerned, her ability to speak on every subject, she was extremely well informed. And then she goes on to talk about her enthusiasm for the unicameral legislature. She knew procedure, and she was a person who went around getting signatures and support. And so again, this camaraderie, this willingness to work together and to be respectful of each other and to see the strengths of their fellow delegates was something that really comes through in the oral history interviews and in the manuscript materials. So here are the primary sources that are that I could find that are available about Arlene Reichert. Obviously, the papers that I processed, and these are linked. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with you, so you can link directly to them, or to the guides or catalog records to them, so you know where they live and where you can access them. Some of them are available online. Most of them are only available physically. And then we've got Lucille Spear here, and she was actually the oldest delegate, and she said she was also the shortest. She told a funny little story about how she was seated all the way in the back, and because she was so short, sometimes the chair couldn't see her raise her hand when she had a comment, so one of the other delegates' wives gave her a flag so she could hold it up and wave it. And most of the pictures you'll see of Lucille Spear, she is not smiling at all. I mean, she does not look happy ever. But when you listen to her interviews, she is just cracking jokes and telling stories and laughing. So don't let the lack of a smile fool you. She is a really interesting person. And her interviews are really, they just have so much information. We are very, very fortunate that someone took it upon themselves to interview her 11 times. She was from Missoula. She served on the Bill of Rights Committee. As I noted, she was a government documents librarian at the University of Montana, and she was a member of the League of Women Voters. And actually, a lot of the women delegates were members of the League of Women Voters, or the American Association of University Women. So Louise Cross was a member of that. And Dorothy Eck actually started the League of Women Voters chapter in Bozeman. So Lucille admits in her interviews that she was not experienced in debate, and I didn't know all the tricks. But Arlene Reichert was always turning around and saying, get up, you're respected, they'll listen to you. And I wouldn't have said anything, I wouldn't have anything new, it was just repeating. But again, there's so many examples of women doing that, of encouraging another woman delegate to speak up, to say something, to provide information, because they do respect that individual and they know that others respect them. And so kind of building that confidence that you're a part of this process and you should be heard. There's a reason you got elected. And then Dorothy Eck kind of echoing Arlene, saying Lucille Spear was, so far as really knowing constitutional history and everything that had ever been written about writing constitutions, right there. And so Dorothy Eck served in the Montana state legislature for 20 years. And so that's pretty incredible compliment from someone, and clearly a sign of respect. So again, primary sources that you can consult to learn more about Lucille Spear or the ConCon. Her papers are available at the University of Montana's Archives and Special Collections, which is located in the Mansfield Library. And her oral history interview collection is also held there, and it's available online. So you can listen to all of the audio and you can read all of the transcripts online. And hopefully we'll have time at the end of the session and I'll show you a couple of places where those things are located so you have a general sense. Maynann Robinson Ellingson, she lives in Missoula. She's still living today. She was the youngest delegate and she served on the Bill of Rights Committee. Not only did she work closely with Bob Campbell to craft the preamble of the Constitution, but she drafted the equal rights provision of the Constitution. And as you know, the United States, the US Constitution does not have an equal rights amendment, but Montana and many other states do. And so there's currently a fight to say, well, because so many states have it, it means that it should now just be included in the US Constitution. So hopefully that goes through. And I will also say that one of the reasons I was so thrilled and excited to talk to Arlene Reichert was when she was in the legislature in 1980, there was an attempt to get rid of the Equal Rights Amendment in Montana's Constitution. And there are letters from her constituents in Great Falls to her asking her to vote to repeal that amendment. And another example of someone using civil discourse, but still standing up for what they believe in. And she said, she wrote back and she said, I appreciate your point of view, but I worked really hard when I was a ConCon delegate to get the ERA in Montana's Constitution, and I'm not about to vote to repeal it. And that just hit my heart, because it was so wonderful knowing that there was someone in the legislature who understood the importance of that and was unwilling to get rid of it. And so Maynann worked to draft the wording for equal dignity and equal rights in the Constitution. And then she's worked almost 30 years as a public finance attorney in Missoula. So she had a really interesting perspective about the women delegates, and actually a lot of them did. Jean Bowman had said that it was important that they not all vote as a block or be seen to be voting as a block. And Maynann kind of echoed the same sentiment. Even though there were 19 of us, I don't think any of us as individual women felt that our influence, our committee assignments, our ability to contribute was in any way hampered by being a woman. I don't think that we felt the need to collectively organize. So the fact that they still felt like individuals, they didn't feel that they were necessarily tied to some kind of definition of gender, although it still was very much on their minds, but that they could still take a look at the issues and make suggestions based on what they knew, their experience, what their constituents were looking for, the issues that they were looking at. And that could have, pardon me, that could have been a big reason why they actually were able to all get along. And to be kind and thoughtful and respectful to each other. And then Lucille Spear, again, so many great anecdotes, but she said that Maynann was witty, quick, sense of humor, and just as sharp as could be on the retort. She could answer any of the delegates, experienced like Marshall Murray or not. There wasn't anyone like her. And that admiration was expressed among a lot of the women delegates whose oral history interviews I was able to access. And so there's an oral history interview with Maynann at the University of Montana's archives, and it's available online. And then Carol Van Valkenburg, a former journalism professor here at UM, also did a StoryCorps interview with Maynann just recently. And so that's also online, so I encourage you to check those out if you want to know more. Dorothy Eck. So many people consider Dorothy to be sort of the grande dame of Montana politics, in the sense that she was really influential, kind of a lot like Jeanette Rankin. Her influence was wide-reaching, and she encouraged young people on sort of both sides of the aisle, regardless of party affiliation, to enter politics. If she knew that there was a young person interested in entering politics, she was always more than happy to chat with them and to encourage them and say, hey, you should go for it. We need people like you in the legislature. She was from Bozeman, and she served on the Bill of Rights Committee. And the three things that she really, really worked hard on, so, you know, as you can tell, most of these women delegates, or any of the delegates, kind of picked specific issues that they knew a lot about and that they were really passionate about, and they worked on those. She fought for the right to know, because previously there were, in the legislature, you could have committees that would meet and they didn't have to make available any of their notes, their transcripts. They didn't have to let the public know they were meeting. They didn't have to do any of that. And so that was a concern for a lot of the convention delegates, and Dorothy Eck was one of the people who worked hard to get the language right for that. And she also fought for the inclusion of Article 10, which is commonly known as Indian Education for All, that Montana's indigenous peoples should have their history and culture represented in the classroom at the primary and secondary level. Dorothy Eck was also the first woman to hold a high office in Montana on the local government commission, and that was something that was put together after the Con to sort of help local governments around the state figure out how to implement some of the new changes in the Montana Constitution as it affected communities, cities, and counties. She served as a Montana state senator for 20 years, and she inspired many people, including Dorothy Bradley and Bob Brown, to run for the state legislature. And both of those individuals were also gubernatorial candidates as well. So they didn't just serve for a couple of years. They served for a long time. And then here's that letter from Jean Bowman talking about, I don't think as women we'd ever vote as a bloc anyway. But she also mentions what it's like to be a woman at the convention. I don't like to be patted on the shoulder or called kiddo. That is the nickname I have acquired among some of the delegates here. And so voicing some irritation and frustration, rightly so, about the way that women delegates were perceived, because she knew that Dorothy could probably empathize with her. But then saying, because of this, we need to be really careful that we don't give the impression that we are a bloc, because then it will make those individuals who are treating us that way even more suspicious than they are already, thinking that we're all going to just gang up on them and try to force something down their throats. Although I think that's really unnecessary to think, but certainly that was the experience that she was having. And so Dorothy's papers are available to look at the Historical Society. There's a great oral history interview with her there as well. And then we have one here at the University of Montana's archives, and it is available online. Louise Cross, so she was a representative from Glendive, and she chaired the Natural Resources and Agriculture Committee. She was the only woman to chair a CONCON committee. And she was not, I shouldn't have put instrumental. She wasn't just instrumental, she was the driving force behind getting the phrase a clean and healthful environment into Montana's Constitution. And we are the only state in the country that has that kind of wording in our Constitution, guaranteeing Montana's a clean and healthful environment. And that's pretty significant. And she was focused on environmental issues. She was from Eastern Montana, and so that's an area that has a lot of strip mining going on. So that was part of her interest. And she continued to work on that her entire life, even after the CONCON. And she also found she was very interested in local government and local government history. And so she founded and was the first curator of the museum in Glendive. And so there are a lot of letters from constituents to Louise Cross about strip mining, about the effects on the environment. And she always responds with, you know, she was really good. They were all really good about responding. There are lots of responses back to constituents, encouraging them if they could come to the public hearings so that they could speak, encouraging them if they were writing to someone who was interested in unicameral, referring them to someone like Arlene Reichert, etc. But I love this letter because she just says, your concern is my concern on strip mining. And so she goes on to talk to this individual about what she thinks is going to happen in terms of what they can get in the Constitution, and then also what might need to happen after the convention is over. And again, Lucille Spear, commenting on Louise Cross, she said that one debate that went on for the longest was the environmental and natural resources, about the clean and healthful environment phrase. And so knowing that that was a hard-fought battle, that was not something that went through fairly quickly. So Louise Cross was the chairman of that committee. She came from a big ranch over in the eastern part of the state. She had a committee that was, it seemed as though most of her committee was not in sympathy with her stand, improving the environment. So so even though she was chair of the committee, she did not really have the support of her committee members. And so it's amazing that that got in at all. And I have to wonder if she hadn't been the chair of that committee, if we would even have that in our Constitution today. So her papers are at the Historical Society, and we also have an online interview here at the University of Montana archives. So I put the League of Women Voters here because I think it's really important to note that a lot of these women were members of that organization. And one of the things about the League of Women Voters is it's about the issues for them, not about the party. League of Women, and many of the women who were members of that expressed that in their interviews, that they joined it specifically because they wanted to learn more about political issues, and they liked that it wasn't partisan. So it didn't matter what political party you were from. You were going to be mixing with people with a variety of interests and a variety of viewpoints, but you were going to get really well educated about the issues. So these women coming into the convention, in some ways, I think were more prepared than a lot of the men. I mean, they had studied the issues. If they were part of the League of Women Voters, they had been the ones going to the state Capitol and lobbying to have a constitutional convention, because there actually had to be a vote on that before it was decided that that would happen. And the League of Women Voters was instrumental in getting, creating awareness around getting a convention and getting the Constitution revised, and then also encouraging people to vote to ratify the Constitution. And the Historical Society and the University of Montana Archives have League of Women Voters records. So if you wanted to look at their papers, you can. There are a lot of other women's materials that I just did not have the time to do the research on for this presentation. But there are all kinds of primary sources. So Lynn Sparks Keeley from Butte, her collection is available at the Butte Silverbow Public Archives. And Veronica O'Sullivan, there's an oral history interview with her at that archives as well. The University of Montana's archives holds Daphne Bugby Jones's papers. She was another delegate. She was from Helena originally, but then she taught at the University of Montana. She was a well-known architect. And she and Dorothy Eck were two of the first, I think they were the first women lobbyists to the Montana State Legislature. Prior to them going there and lobbying in the late 60s, early 70s, there weren't women lobbyists. The Historical Society has an interview with Daphne. Jean Bowman, who wrote about not liking being called kiddo, she participated in a roundtable discussion that is available online, and it was made available by Montana Tech, and she and a couple of other people are talking about the legacy and the significance of the Constitutional Convention. There's an oral history interview with Betty Babcock and her papers at the Historical Society. And as you know, Tim Babcock was governor when the convention happened, and she was a delegate to the convention. And then just some fun things about women. I recall Rachel Mansfield telling a story that she was at the Wool Growers Convention, and Archie, another ConCon delegate, was there. Archie was being very belligerent, said if she were a man, he'd throw her off the platform. And she told him, "Come ahead, I can handle you." So I think it's funny because, well, it's funny. I think it's funny. And I think that Rachel Mansfield there's not a whole lot I could find about her. So these little tidbits, these are just great. And they're part of the fun of primary sources. I mean, I don't know if you can relate that specifically to civil discourse. You might even say that's not exactly civil discourse, but the fact that this woman was standing up for herself, I find that very encouraging. And then Margaret Warden, she was a very active Democrat from Great Falls, and Margaret did a good job. She didn't really introduce or vote for change very much, but she made a real contribution to the convention on the Public Information Committee. She did more there than I think she did on the provisions of the Constitution. And that was one thing about the Constitutional Convention when it was all over and they were preparing to have a vote on it. The committee was, the convention delegates were not allowed to use any of the budget that they had been given by the state to do any kind of campaigning for the Constitution. So they went out on their own time, their own money, and they worked really hard to get the public sort of prepped for this, to provide them with information, to answer questions, to do whatever they could to let the people of Montana know what they had been working hard on and what the Constitution, you know, the revisions to it, what they were, why they were important, and why people should vote for it. And it did pass. So that's my presentation. Does anyone have questions? Oh, I was going to show you where you can find those interviews. So let's see here. Here we go. So the interviews that are available online through the University of Montana's archives. It's through ScholarWorks, the university's online repository. For those of you who haven't been there, I really encourage you to check it out. There's all kinds of great digitized content, from podcasts to oral history interviews. The Montana Kaiman is fully digitized and available online. So if you're doing research from home and you want a Kaiman article, you can just keyword search. So the Montana Feminist Oral History Project Has a lot of interviews with a variety of women from around the state, including a few con delegates. And then if you look through the oral history list right here, you can see all of the collections that we have available. And they're listed alphabetically, so you could go down to the Lucille Spear interviews right here. So that's where you can find our digitized content. And then for the collections, the manuscript materials, so none of those have been digitized, but the guides to them are available online through a platform called Archives West. And so here are the Dorothy Eck papers. You can read a little bit about what's in the collection. You can read a little bit about the biography of that individual. And then this content description just kind of walks you through what specifically is in the collection. And then here you'll see a box and a folder list. So in this folder, there's correspondence related to constitutional revision. In box 1, folder 11, there are news clippings about the 1968 elections and the 69 legislature. So that just gives you kind of a general idea of what's in the collection. If there's anything you're kind of interested in, you could go through here, keyword search, or just scroll down and see if that might be possibly in there. If your grandmother was really interested in the con and she lived in Bozeman and her last name started with a B, it's possible that maybe she wrote to Dorothy Eck. So if you were really curious, you could go to the Historical Society and take a look in box 1, folder 6, and see if there's anyone in there you know. So I think that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. We still have 20 minutes left, so we have plenty of time for questions. I have one question that came to me from Miranda Gramling. Miranda, if you want to ask your question, I think it's a really good one.
Hello, sorry.
Hello.
So of those 19 delegates that were female, were any of them Native American?
No, not that I know of. I mean, you can't tell just from looking at a picture, but I don't believe there was, I really don't know if there was any indigenous representation on the, among the delegates, men or women, or anyone who identified as gender non-binary. So unfortunately, it was not as representative as we would have liked. I mean, it was pretty much a lot like the vote, give the women the vote. Who really got the vote? White women. So yeah, still need to make a lot of strides in that. But there are, if you look in the verbatim transcripts when they're talking about Indian education for all, I do believe they invited a lot of indigenous high school students and others from around the state to come, and they did come when they were debating that particular article to talk about why it was important to them. So I'm not saying that's enough, I'm just saying that happened.
Yeah. Thank you for that information.
Yeah.
We have another question that just came in from Lillian. If you want to ask your question, it's another really good one.
Sure. Hi, I was just curious what you think the attributing factors are to the large number of women delegate representatives during the con.
You know, I feel like Montana in some ways is kind of a unique state because, and I've heard a lot of other people who've been involved in Montana politics for a long time or have researched it, and they have also pointed out the uniqueness of the state in that Montana voters don't always vote along party lines. They kind of tend to want to be a little bit more independent about how they vote. And so if they know you well and they trust you, I'm not sure if gender is the most important factor to them. I wouldn't say it doesn't go unnoticed, but I do think that sometimes it's just kind of like, well, I know this person, they're from my community, I trust them, and I know what they stand for, and it aligns with my values and my beliefs, so I'm comfortable with them representing me. That would be the best answer I could give you, but I am not a Montana politics scholar at all, so that's just me.
Thank you. I appreciate your feedback.
Sure.
If anyone else has questions, if you want to send them into the chat right now.
There we go.
Otherwise, that's all we have for now, unless there's anything else that you want to talk about, Hannah, that maybe came to mind while we were discussing these questions.
I would just say, if you are interested in women in Montana politics, there's so many great resources out there. Really, really. It's, like I said, I didn't even have time to look at all of them. I still need to listen to the Veronica O'Sullivan interview. I still need to go make a trip to Butte and take a look at the materials, the Keeley materials. I really wish that we had materials from people like Jean Bowman and Virginia Blend, who died only a couple of years after the convention, actually, and Rachel Mansfield. I think, so, and this is also, for me as an oral historian, this is like a plug, but if you know people who need to be interviewed, you should interview them. Really, truly, it's not that hard to do an oral history interview. I'm always happy to talk to people about how to do that. That's one of the things I love. And even during COVID, now there are tons and tons of great resources if you want to do remote interviewing. It's super important. This is where we get our information, and people can say that oral history interviews are really subjective, but I would say that everything is subjective. They're never going to get 100% objectivity in any historical source. So people are able to capture history and make it available to others long-term when they do oral history interviews. So you don't have to collect every scrap of paper. You can just go talk to somebody you know and record it. So, and you get the best stuff, Lucille Spear did say that the entire time she was at the convention, the chair, Leo Graybill, kept calling her Mrs., and Lucille Spear never married. And so she corrected him a few times, and then she got tired of it. So all through the verbatim transcript, it's Mrs. Spear. So finally, at the last day, they were allowed to go up and make, make corrections to the record. They couldn't change the old transcripts, but they could, note that was incorrect. And so she went up and she said she was going to have to take it to the Bill of Rights Committee because it was a violation of her rights to not be called correctly. So Leo Graybill said, okay, we'll change this. So it's Ms. Lucille Spear, not Mrs. Yeah. So those are great little, among all of the information, there are those moments that kind of make you light up. Again, that letter that I found from Arlene Reichert to her constituents saying, I will not vote to repeal the Equal Rights Amendment. That was, when you read something like that, it's sort of like historic gold. You're like, there's documentation that someone's paying attention, and that they're working really hard. So yeah, please come visit us at the archives. Please check out the oral history interviews that are available online. And if you're in Helena, yeah. And if you want a copy of the PowerPoint, so you can get the links for the materials and where they are, or if you just want to know where something is, you can totally email me. I don't know. Here, I'll put my email address in the chat.
Awesome. While you're doing that, we did get another question and then kind of a point of order that I think is really interesting that we can address. Julia, did you want to ask your question real quick?
Yeah, I was just curious about how you got involved in this originally and kind of what your background is with this kind of research.
I have no background in this kind of research. So I got my degree in poetry at the University of Montana. So I'm well out of my comfort zone. But while I was here getting my MFA, I got to work in the archives as a student assistant. By the way, we do hire students. And I fell in love with it. I loved the opportunity to do the research. I loved being around so many different kinds of materials, from rare books to maps to manuscripts to diaries. Oral histories are something that I've always loved. And so when there was a staff position available, I took it, and then I started getting my master's in library science 2 years ago. So my last class, I had to do a field study, and I decided to go to Helena to do it so I could work in a different archives. And Jody Foley, the state archivist, emailed me a list of collections, and 3 of them were Montana women ConCon delegates. And I said, hey, I feel like I have a little bit of information about that, because I know we have oral history interviews, and I've heard enough about it from editing oral history interviews and transcribing them that really interests me. And then the more I dug, the more I realized, whoa, this is pretty incredible. Again, the unprecedented representation, and then just all of the back and forth. And of course, again, with the political climate, it's hard not to look at the differences and go, wow, these people were working really hard for Montana, and they put that first, and they could be nice about it. That, like, you know, it made me feel like, one, what the heck is going on right now that we can't do that? But 2, it's possible. So it's possible. So yeah, and I needed that. I needed that hope. And then again, like I said, those letters saying, hey, look, we're women and ERA is important to us. We're not taking that away. That also, yeah, it came at a good time, because with COVID and then the political climate, it's just the right time. So yeah, even if you don't think you're an archivist, if you were to get a job in the archives, you might change your mind.
I love that. That was a great story. So we have G. Wykes, if you want to, I think this is interesting for students, if there's any students in here. Yeah, go for it.
Yes, I'm sorry not to have the video on.
Hi, Gigi. How are you?
I'm fine, Anna. That was a magnificent presentation, really
Thank
inspiring.
you.
We have an experimental class being offered for winter session in anthropology by a really phenomenal oral historian and archivist, Nikki Manning, and she's teaching it. It's a 491 for the winter session, and it's going to be so good. I'm tempted to take it.
Yeah.
So I would really encourage anyone who needs, or is interested in having an intensive 3-week course on it. I'm sure she'll be using the archives.
Oh yeah.
Primary material.
Yeah, and it's not as intimidating as you think, by the way. Everyone's really intimidated by archives. We work really hard to make sure you feel welcome, that things are really clear, and that you can find what you're looking for. There's always someone at the desk to help you. Just a little plug for the archives. Don't be afraid to come in. We love having people come in.
The other announcement I wanted to make, the AAUW has paid internships for the spring, and we're just getting them set up. So I want to send out information, and I will send it to the DiverseU. Maybe you can send it out to participants in the day today and tomorrow, so that students know about the opportunities. They're open to everyone, but they will focus on gender equity issues for 2021.
Nice. Did you have a question, Gigi? I'm sorry, I kind of interrupted you.
I don't. My only question was who you think we should be interviewing now.
Everybody. No, I mean, there are so many projects that I think would be wonderful. I am working on a native COVID project. Right now, I am kind of getting that all laid out, because I do think that Indigenous people here on the reservations are having a unique experience with COVID. And I think that should be documented. Certainly, documenting this time period, whether it's the political climate or COVID or all of the above. The Racial Equity Project, I would love it if they were doing oral history interviews. And I've talked to them a couple times, but I know they're busy, so that's been kind of pushed to the back burner. The CAIO, Native American Student Association, that would be wonderful if the history of that organization was documented. Same thing with the Black Student Union, or the Women's Center, the history of the Women's Center. Yeah, but really any anything you're involved in. Heck, if you're involved in rodeo club, I didn't even know we had a rodeo club, but how that got started and the fact that it's actually it's been around for a while. I mean, I think that's really kind of interesting because that's not what I think of when I think of the University of Montana. But, you know, it's a student club, and the history of that and a representation of students there is really fascinating. And I'm from Wyoming, so, you know, I mean, we went to the rodeo. You know, it's not that foreign. It's just, it feels that way in Montana. I mean, you could do an oral history project on runners in Missoula. That's a huge community, and there's lots of history there. The Humane Society, I think it would be interesting if someone did interviews or an oral history project on the treatment of animals and or the care of animals. And yeah, I mean, there's just so many. I can't really tell you what I think is most important. I think what's most important is you find a topic that doesn't have a lot of documentation, and then think about why that is and whether or not other people are trying to find that information. So, I mean, I would always argue for more oral history interviews with women or with members of the LGBTQIA+ community, you know, because I do think it will be interesting in the 21st century as it progresses, how we start the terminology we use and how we start titling our oral history collections. Because should we be using gendered terms for a collection like the Women's Oral History Project? Maybe, but then who does it exclude? Are we going to have another one that's specifically a gender non-binary oral history collection? And, you know, is it just going to focus on that? But what if someone identifies that way, but that's not what they want to talk about? So, you know, it's going to be interesting, because as we talk about gender for a long time, so long, it's just been a binary. But what happens when we open that up and it's not? How do we group these oral history projects? How do we group our interviewees? So this is the stuff I love to talk about, though. I'm just like on my soapbox, so I'll stop. Did I answer your question, Gigi? I don't know if I did.
Yes, you did, Hannah. I'll just point out Diane Sands did the women's oral histories in the 80s. And then when we did a second round in 2000, we called it the Feminist History Project.
Yeah.
So
and I love that.
Interviewing Bob Campbell and Virginia Egley and Louise Cross. We were interviewing a whole range of people on issues that were not women's history necessarily, Montana history.
Yeah, and that's great. And so I think, you know, thinking about it in terms of like subject or topic rather than gender is the way we're gonna see things start to shift from now on, hopefully. Because I would hate for anyone to not feel included in a project or not see themselves represented in the projects that are listed on ScholarWorks because we're using gendered terms or ableist terms or, you know, so many terms that we haven't previously thought about. That's another one. The Disability Student Services and the Associated Disability Student something or other of University of Montana. That would be a great one for someone to do. The history of that, how it came up in the 80s. Yeah, because I've seen enough documentation from university publications that prior to ADSUM and DSS being established, most university presidents were like, well, you're just going to have to do the best you can, you know, and hope that people help you out. It's like, that's not an appropriate response. I don't think it's an appropriate response. So, but yeah, if you're interested in doing a project, if you want information on how to just do a single interview, I would love to talk to you about that. Certainly there are public history courses being taught here. Kyle Volk and Leif Fredrickson have taught them, and then the interviews have come to the archives. So, you know, I'm doing mine sort of volunteer on my own time because I just love doing it, but I know that's not always realistic for students. So
I think Claire Arsenis is teaching public history for the spring, making history public, and Anya Jabor is coordinating the internships for the public history certificate. So
that's
they
great.
have 4 points of contact in the history department. Yeah. And then in anthropology, it's Kelly Dixon and Nikki Manning.
That's great. And I should say that Anya's, the internship for that certificate, the first batch of those interviews is up on ScholarWorks. It's the University of Montana COVID Oral History Project. So I just put that up 2 weeks ago. So, yeah.
Folks.